Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening as we are joined by Caroline Zancan and Alison Espach to celebrate the release of Notes on Your Sudden Disappearance. It appears that many of you already know Alison, but before we get started, I will just give a little bit of background that you may not know or you may already know. So Alison is the author of the novel The Adult, a New York Times Editor's Choice and a Barnes & Noble Discovered Pick. Her short stories and essays have appeared in Vogue, Joyland, Glamour, Salon, McSweeney's, among many others. And her newest work, being what we have all come here to celebrate, Notes on Your Sudden Disappearance, I quote, unputdownable, insightful, funny, and emotionally profound. I can attest that this is true because I read it in 2 days and probably would have read it faster if I didn't have to work, eat, and sleep. So I loved it, highly recommend, and I'm excited to hear you talk about it. Caroline is a senior editor at Holt, where she acquires and publishes literary and upmarket fiction, particularly drawn to story-driven literary fiction with a big pitch. A recent acquisition of Holt, I am pleased to hand it over to Alison and Caroline to discuss Notes on Your Sudden Disappearance.
I think we're going to start with a reading from Alison, right?
Yeah, how does that sound, guys? First, thank you all for coming. I have been looking forward to this day for a very long time, as I'm sure some of you also. And yeah, I woke up this morning, I've been so busy trying to finish the semester, and every day has been kind of a rush to get things done. And I woke up this morning and I had that 10 seconds where I was like, what am I going to do today? I was like, should I go out to the garden? Maybe I'll go take a walk. I was like, oh no! And when I remembered that today was today, it was just, I don't know, just a great feeling, a great day. And thank you all for celebrating with me. It wouldn't be the same without you. So I'm going to read from the beginning of the book, since it just came out today. I don't think many of you have read it. So why not start at the beginning? And so I don't think there's anything to say other than this is my book. The chapter or the section title is The State of the Union 1998. And can you hear me okay? I'm trying to shout, but
we can.
Okay.
Beautiful.
You disappeared on a school night. Nobody was more surprised by this than me. If I believed in anything when I was 13, I believed in the promise of school nights. I believed in the sacred ritual of homework, then dinner, and then the laying out of our clothes for the next morning, something Mom insisted on from the very beginning. Mom said it was important to wake up, having made the decision about what to wear, so each night we made the decision. We brushed our teeth. We stared at each other in the mirror as the foam built in our mouths, and eventually one of us would speak. Hello, you'd say, and this would be so funny for some reason that I can't understand now. You would start laughing, a loud burst of confetti out your mouth, and so I would start laughing, an ugly, inward-sucking sound that always made Mom run into a room and say, Sally, are you okay? Which made us laugh even harder. She's just laughing, Mom, you said. We got into our beds. We stared up at the glow-in-the-dark stars that were arranged on the ceiling to spell our names, an idea I hadn't liked at first, since I wanted the ceiling to be an accurate reflection of the sky. But you said that was impossible. You said, the ceiling will never be the sky, Sally, and I didn't argue, because no matter how old I became, you were always 3 years older than me. You always knew things I didn't know, like there are 88 constellations in the sky and only 22 stars in the pack, just enough to spell our names. So we stuck the stars to the ceiling, and I spent the rest of my childhood looking up, listening to Kathy tell Sally about all the other things she knew. The sky isn't actually blue. The rain evaporates and goes back up to the sky. And did you know that trees can feel pain, you asked. No, I said, but I wasn't surprised. I had suspected as much ever since Dad told us that the maple tree outside our bedroom window was nearly dead. It was so old, Dad said, it might have been planted by an actual Puritan, a fact that did not impress me as much as it scared me. The tree sat on our lawn, hunched and tangled, and I didn't like looking at it, the way I didn't like seeing the bone spurs on Dad's feet when he took his socks off at the beach, or the bottom row of yellow teeth that were only visible when Mom laughed really hard. It was death, I knew, waiting in the most unexpected places, inside Mom's laughter, at the end of Dad's toes, in the bright green leaves outside her bedroom window that couldn't have looked more alive. So I pulled down the window shade each night before I crawled into your bed. You never pushed me away then. You liked feeling the soft tips of my fingers braiding a strand of your hair. Well, they can. That's what Billy Barnes told me, you said. He knows things like that. His dad's a florist. Then I was a very good listener, very attentive, the teachers often wrote on my report card. I always had a follow-up question. Who's Billy Barnes, I asked. Who is Billy Barnes, you said? Like I was supposed to know. But I didn't know anyone except the people in my first grade class. We were kept hidden away from the other kids, safe in our own private wing of the school. I am only dancing the football tango with him tomorrow. What's the football tango, I asked. Just some dance the teachers made up to celebrate Thanksgiving, you said. I don't really get it, but who cares? That's not the point. The point was, you were in 4th grade and he was in 5th, and you shouldn't have been partners, but you were paired up anyway. You were the same exact height. It's fate, you said. And it was the next morning it happened. You dressed up as a cheerleader and he dressed up as a football player, and you tangoed across the gym and you whispered something nice about your hair, and that was that. You were in love. What did he say about your hair? I asked. I was starting to learn that I did not have the right kind of hair. It was nothing like yours, which dried straight out of the shower. Mine was curly, hard to control, like one of those evil cartoon trees that pull people in with their branches when they get too close. That's what Rick Stevenson said, on the bus anyway, just before he told me about his chinchilla at home, the one that had started to recently eat its own babies. I don't know, you said. Billy didn't specify. After the dance, you started talking to me about Billy all of the time at night, but you never spoke to him at school. What would I even say, you asked. I was surprised you'd ask me. What did I know about speaking to boys then? I could hardly even speak to my own grandmother and grandfather when they sat on our couch during Christmas. I would quietly pick at the hem of my dress while you asked them questions about their old coal stove and all the milk that used to arrive at their doorstep in bottles. You accepted their gifts with an enthusiasm I couldn't fake. Thank you so much for the make-your-own bubblegum kit, you said to Grandma, like you meant it, and I was in disbelief. Were we actually excited about making our own bubblegum? I couldn't tell. You were so good and natural, Dad said, after we watched you be Peter Pan and Peter Pan. But talking to Billy was not as easy for you. He's in 5th grade, you said, and he's going to be a famous basketball player one day. That's what all the teachers say. So you just watched him from afar, paid close attention to him at recess, collected information to bring back to me each night, listed off all the things Billy liked: pepperoni pizza, the Chicago Bulls, praying mantises, and his dad, who had recently broken his neck. It's really tragic, you said. Then you told the story as if you had been at Bill's tree and garden when Billy's dad fell off the ladder. He must have fallen 20 feet through the air, Sally. It was crazy. He cracked his spine in 2 places. Is he going to die? I asked. I couldn't imagine someone breaking their neck and not dying. I imagined Billy's father's neck, bent at a right angle. No, you said. He'll be fine. But still, it's really scary. I mean, who knew being a florist was so dangerous? I remember you sounded proud for some reason, like you had broken your own neck. You told me so much about Billy that by the time I actually saw him, it felt surreal. We stepped out of Dad's car and onto the parking lot of Bill's tree and garden, and you clutched my arm like you did whenever we saw a fox in the woods. It's Billy Barnes, you whispered. We knew foxes lived here, but we were always surprised to see one in our yard. It was Connecticut. It was the suburbs. We lived 1 street away from a Dunkin' Donuts. We never expected to be so lucky, to be in the right place at the right time, in the same parking lot where Billy was moving small white trees out of a van. Dad went inside to get marigolds for the mailbox, but we stood quietly by the entrance. We plucked petals off a nearby rose bush, pretended like we weren't watching him, but we were, of course. We were studying him very closely, though now it's hard to remember much about that moment. All I can picture is his hair, so thick and brown, like it was made out of plastic, like he was one of my Fisher-Price toys. "What are you still doing out here, girls?" Dad said when he returned with 2 pots of gold flowers. The moment was over. "Nothing," we said, but we both knew we were guilty of something. We stuffed the red petals into our pockets before Dad could see, and you promised me it wasn't stealing because the petals would grow back bigger and brighter, like the worms we sometimes cut in the woods. When Dad started driving, you pulled a petal out of your pocket, started running it along your bottom lip. "It's so soft," you said, handing it to me. "Feel." I pressed the rose petal to my lip and felt its softness, and that was that.
Thank you for that. I want to start by acknowledging how special this book is and how much I love this book. I know this is a hometown crowd, so you're like, yeah, we know that Alison's special. We know, like, we also love her. But sometimes it's when it is, you know, your family that you need someone from the outside world to be like, this is an incredible person. This is an incredible book. I have been a fiction editor since, you know, for over a decade. It's my job to read books every day. I sometimes read more than one novel in a day. And I can count on one hand how many times I have read something as quickly as I read Alison's novel. I can count on one hand the number of books that made me feel the way that her book did. You know, the tears would still be drying on my face as I would be howling in laughter. And I'm in very good company in saying these things and feeling this way about the book. You know, they don't just let me buy any book I like. You know, a lot of people have to read and also like. And more than that, you know, because I am an editor, part of my job is to make the book as good as it can be, and the other part of it is to get it in as many hands as I possibly can, and just kind of shake the world and say, pay attention to this book. And so I hand out from the moment we have ARCs, which is, you know, these days 6 to 8 months before a book comes out, I hand it out to people who don't work in the industry but have book clubs, or to people who, you know, are freelance editors, or just people who have a big social media presence. I'm always handing out books, and 9 times out of 10 you'll hand a book out to a person and never hear from them again. And that's okay. I know that's part of it. When you're constantly hawking books, you know, people just expect that from you. And to a person, every single person that I gave this book to texted me or called me or emailed me. Sometimes it was a week later, sometimes it was a month later, to be just like, thanks a lot. I was openly weeping on a plane for 6 hours on the way to the Bahamas. Or, you know, wow, this is such a spectacular book. Like, just thank you for giving it to me. It's almost to like a perilous degree, because now they're just like, what's next? And I'm like, sorry, these books don't just like come along all the time. You're gonna have to wait until I have something that's special for you again. So all of this is just a long way of saying that Alison is a unicorn. This book is extraordinary. You're in for a treat if you haven't read it. It's a really phenomenal, extraordinary thing she's done here. But I'll stop being your mom now and ask you some questions.
No, continue on. This is like the nicest moment I've had in months.
So the book is many things. It's hard. It's almost hard to pitch it, which again is part of my job, is to say, you know, you want the elevator pitch, which is to say what a book is in 2 minutes or one line. And this book is so many things. It's kind of hard to do that. It's a love story. It's a story about sisters. It's a story of a family mourning. It's, you know, it's a coming of age story. It's so many things in one book, but it's also very tight. You're turning pages at every moment. But one thing it really is a sister story, and I think that is one of the things that I find most striking, just because, you know, I am a sister, and you nail it. I'm also a little sister, the way that Sally is, and you nail the texture of being just behind somebody who's cooler and wiser and just more in the know, the way that older sisters always are, and you capture it so well. I sent this to every sister pair I know. I sent it to my sister, and you do not have a sister.
I do not.
So I wanna know how you did that, how you pulled that trick out, and you know, if there was a sister pair that inspired you, or if there's someone, that is like a sister to you, or just how you got there?
Well, thank you for, oh my God, you're so kind. Yeah, I feel like people are very disappointed when they find out I don't have a sister. I've had to say that a lot this week. I'm like, I don't.
Impressed.
Sorry. But so I think the reason I wrote this book is because I don't have a sister, actually, to be honest. I mean, don't get me wrong, my brothers were great, and we had a lot of fun. But I was a kid who read a ton of books about sisters and just how amazing it was, right? And I would say as a kid, really, like, I convinced in the way that kids can convince themselves of really warped things. I was like, my life is ruined because I don't have a sister. You know, like, I could not conceive of happiness without having that, like, you know, after reading Little Woman, you know, and it's just like, how, you know, you don't get to be part of the March family. But, so I did have a longing for a sister throughout my life, which I think made it super fun to just kind of live out the fantasy and like, lean into the intimacy that I always imagined and have witnessed, you know, between sisters that I know. So that was certainly part of it. I will say, you know, I had great girlfriends growing up, some who are here now. And Sarah and I in particular, we used to spend tons of time in the fourth bedroom just like talking. I mean, we would just talk for 48 hours. And so I would say much of what I was sort of conjuring up when I was writing was just that feeling of being in that bedroom and just feeling like you could say anything in the world to this person and feeling so connected to that person. And so I don't know if that's what it's like to have a sister, but that's the fantasy of it, I guess. And so yeah, so I drew upon that and just the kind of intimacy that I've been lucky to have as a friend to so many women. I felt really grateful for that. So
That answers that. Good. Yeah. Well done. The other thing this book very much is it's a story about a family that is mourning, is going through a grieving process, but it's also really funny. And I almost like checked myself the first time I used that word, because I'm like, is it actually funny? And there are moments that are just actually funny, and not outside of the sadness or the mourning, just right in the thick of it. You know, one of my favorite blurbs acknowledges that within a sentence sometimes you will be both sad and happy, to the extreme on both ends. And I'm curious if, you know, you always knew that humor was going to be part of the story, if you kind of had to work your way up to it, if you had to talk yourself into it, if you were, you know, surprised the first time a joke was on the page, or, you know, what the process of adding that element of it was like.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that humor was always part of it from the very beginning. I think it's, for me, I couldn't really conceive of writing a book about something so dark and so sad without pairing it with the levity of laughter and the kind of natural humor that emerges throughout the day. And I think that, you know, for me, you know, as a lot of you know here, and as you do too, I lost a brother when I was a kid, and so much of the book, I hope this is not a spoiler, explores the grief of Sally, the narrator, sort of losing that sister very early on. It's like page 90, so it's not that much of a spoiler.
Every review so far has spoiled it, so at this point,
the
go
entire
ahead.
plot. Still grateful. So, you know, it's a book about the wonderful intimacy between sisters, but, you know, I think the fact that I didn't have one, and also the fact that I did experience the loss of a sibling very early on in my teenage years, came together to produce a book where it's also exploring, like, what happens when you lose that relationship, right? You know, the relationship that you depend so much on, you know, that you've never imagined your life without it. And so And so that's really dark. But my experience of it was, that grief creates a lot of humor. I mean, grief is weird, grief is absurd, death is absurd, especially like in the modern world. And so I just found myself, in so many situations with my family or just on my own, finding something humorous, and maybe having that question of like, am I allowed to laugh? Or can we? And laughing in those moments for me was the only relief. And I think joking around is such creative energy, and can remind us of the good in the world when we need it the most. And so I just couldn't really conceive of writing a book that asked you to explore such intense grief without giving you those breaks, right? Allowing you to laugh at some of the weird stuff that were real, I mean, I think for Sally, the narrator in the book, I drew upon some of my own experiences, or really just some of my observations of the absurdities of it, right? Like, you're a teenager and you've never encountered death before, but then you're like, well, what kind of casket do we pick for my sister? Well, she was kind of a diva, so like, we're gonna get like the high-end casket, and so like for me, that was just the way that I saw the world, and I don't know, Sally did too.
Well, you talking about the overlap between you and Sally it's going to make me jump ahead to the other side of my sheet here, because that was one of my other questions for you, is you and Sally. Sally is such a fully baked, three-dimensional, real character that from very early on I just kind of conflated Alison with Sally. I was just like, you can't invent a character and have her be this real, so this must be Alison. So like sometimes even in my notes there I'd be like, well, on the 10 pages ago you said this and now you're saying this, and I'd say, oh no, Sally said this. So like I had to separate the two of them. And I am curious, and I realized early on that this could be total projection on my part, like maybe you are nothing like Sally, and maybe you are the complete opposite. But because she feels so real to me and like such a real person, I very early on started thinking of it as someone who was inspired by you and your worldview. And I'm curious if there was ever a point in writing it where you're just like, you know what, I'm going to completely detour. Sally's going to take a right turn where I took a left. Like, I'm going to have her do a thing I never would have done, never could have done, or, have her do something that you wish you had done, or have her not do something you wish you hadn't done. It's kind of like what the process was of taking your worldview and your experiences and putting it into someone who is not a real person but feels very much like a real person.
Yeah. So this is a good question to ask in the wake of the People blurb.
Yes,
People magazine blurbed it this weekend.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful. Amazing.
They called it riveting, guys. This is great. This is gonna sound
amazing
so well.
blurb. And I was reading, I was so excited, and then the last line it said, this is based on the author's life. And I was like, oh my God. No, that's not true. So just inspired by is the word we've settled on. So I would say that, for me, fiction always begins in a real place with a real feeling, a real question, a real situation. And this book really started for me as a memoir. When I went to graduate school, I took a course in nonfiction, and I took a course from the wonderful Kathleen Finneran, who was my professor at the time, and she was a nonfiction writer. And I wrote a little story, a little memoir piece, and she read it and she was like, oh, I also had a brother who died when he was 16. And it was one of those, like, I don't know, just one of those moments. And she really encouraged me to write about it, and I ended up writing, I didn't know what I was going to do with it. I just knew that, like, I wanted to sort of get it out as intensely as I could. And my poor parents, I remember going home for breaks. I lived across the country at the time. They're like, we're so happy to see you. What are you doing? I'm like, I'm writing a memoir about my childhood at the kitchen counter. when I finished that, though, I felt no desire to publish it. You know, like it was just, I just had no, I don't know. And it didn't really feel like art. It felt like vomiting. Yeah, and but it stayed with me. And so I think when I started really to write what became Notes, I took the initial conceit, or like the initial feeling that led me into writing the memoir, which was also sort of titled Notes on Your Sudden Disappearance. That title's been with me. That, you know, the concept of taking notes on your life for your sibling who's passed was really started in a real place. But for me, it's sort of, I mean, I do always think fiction, you know, you can read fiction and figure out, okay, how does this author think? How do they process things? What makes them laugh? What makes them cry? I mean, that's certainly there and autobiographical in that way. But really, from the very beginning, Sally starts to detour and become her own person. And she begins to, you know, after her sister's death, really the plot of the book becomes the relationship between her and her older sister's boyfriend, right, who continue to talk and find this strange connection in the wake of her death that continues for decades, or I don't know, for 15 years. And for me, you know, I remember being a young kid in 8th grade and being at a funeral or being at a wake and having all my older brother's friends like suddenly talk to me, right? Like suddenly say hello or hug you or cry with you. I mean, it's such a weird experience for anyone who's been through middle school, like to have like the cool basketball player like hug you and weep on your shoulder, you know, like it was very bizarre, but also, you know, speaking of the humor as being some of the relief, like those moments were so meaningful to me, and like the bizarre connections that form after something so terrible. So I, you know, I'm a fiction writer at heart, so it was kind of, you know, I always work off the question of what if, like, sort of, well, what if those conversations continued? What if those conversations evolved into a romance or a love? Like, how would this connection shape-shift over time? And as soon as I started asking those questions, I kind of knew, like, oh, I'm in it. Like, I need to know what happens. And so for me, you know, that's really the detour. That's, that was the fun of creating Sally and getting to live out this sort of other life. And you know, and I will also say, like, to write a memoir, you kind of have to know how it ends. And you kind of have to be in the end. Like, you have to be living the end as you write it. Most memoirs end with the writer being in a state of wealth or prosperity or peace, or they figured it out, you know. And I was like 26 and like still like in therapy, being like, I don't have any problems though, you know. So I was not ready to finish the end of that memoir. Like, I didn't quite know how I was going to resolve the grief for my actual self. And writing Sally was instructional, you know. It was, Anne Sexton is a great poet that I love. She always says her poems are 4 years ahead of her life. And so I sort of thought that way about Sally at the end. Like, I haven't finished grieving, but like Sally's gonna do it. And I'm gonna see what it looks like for her. And like, how do you do that? Like, what does it actually look like to let go and say goodbye in a way that allows you to live the rest of your life, you know?
It's really beautiful. So you talked a little bit about like surprises and what surprised you as you were writing this. I'm curious if you always knew, it sounds like you knew what the objective was in writing this and kind of how you dug in and what your entry point was. Did you always know it was going to be a love story? Did you know how it was going to end, or did you have to kind of write your way through to the end, I guess? What was the biggest surprise for you as you were working right through the story?
You know, I'm always surprised by how long it takes. Like, I'm always so optimistic. I go into every summer being like, this is it. And I tell my agents, like, by June 8th for sure. And June 8th comes and that's not the case. So I am always surprised by how long it takes. But that's really not the spirit of your question. I just wanted to say that. I knew I wanted it to be a love story. I didn't know how it would end, to be honest. I mean, I did know that, I honestly forget who said this to me once, but it was someone great and wise once said to me, it's really nice when you end a book kind of just knowing that the character's okay. You know, like, not all their problems have been solved, but you just sort of feel like they're gonna be okay. And that kind of, you know, depending on the character you're writing, that can mean a lot of different things. And for Sally, it was sort of, has she sort of emotionally resolved the grief that was haunting her through most of her life. And Billy, the romantic partner, her great love, was part of that, right? He was linked to the grief for her. So I think the question became, you know, is this a good relationship or a bad relationship, right? Is Billy a symbol of her grief and is she holding on to it, or does he represent like a new life and happiness that she hasn't had before? And I honestly didn't know that. So as I wrote it and started to figure out who they were, and novelists get really attached to their characters too, and so I started to get attached to them and really I was like, I want this to work. So for me, it's always sort of it happens in the moment, and that not knowing what's going to happen, I think, is important for how I write the scenes, because I will start a scene sometimes not actually knowing what's going to happen by the end of it, and I don't know.
Makes it feel less canned, like there's a spontaneity to it. That's
yeah,
authentic.
I mean, it's also, there is virtue in outlining. Like, it does make life a lot easier, but I just keep finding that that's not my way.
Yeah. So you mentioned Anne Sexton, and I'm curious, like, if there was anyone you looked to as a model for how to do some of the things that you did here. I think that, again, publishing is a comp industry. You want to say this is the next X, or, if you love this book, you'll love this other book. And I think that so much of what you do here is really singular and very rare. The combination of grief and humor, the fact that it is so many different kind of stories in one, but yet it doesn't feel crowded, or that you're dividing the reader's attention by asking us to look in 7 different directions at once. And I'm curious if there were writers you looked to as a guide for how to do that, and if there was anyone whose work inspired you or just, carried you through the end of the process.
Yeah, so I tend to have a hard time reading new things when I'm writing for some reason. I think when you read new things and you're really focused on a project and you read this amazing book and you're like, well, I should just write that book. If it's not a healthy exercise. So I tend to go back to old favorites.
Yeah.
And especially during the parts of the project where, it's a beautiful sunny summer afternoon and everyone I know is out and doing something amazing, and it's like, why am I here, and that's usually when I go back to some of the first stories that kind of just got me going. Laurie Moore, her short story collection, Self-Help, one of the first pieces of contemporary lit that I read in college. A professor handed it to me and he was like, I think you'll like this. And he basically changed my world. Her first story, How to Be an Other Woman, the first line, which is burned into my brain because I've read it so many times, meet in expensive beige coats on a pea soupy night, right? And I just remember hearing that voice for the first time, and it unlocked something for me. Like, she's joking and yet she's serious, right? There's something light about this character, but I have a feeling we're headed toward darkness in a certain way. So she was really the first person who made me feel like I could do what it is that I wanted to do, or that there was a place out there. I kept reading Zavinia Orlowski's poetry collection. She's a colleague of mine at Providence College. It's called Bad Harvest. She writes short prose poetry, so it's a great thing to do. You know, like you just need inspiration, or even just poets are. It's always good for novelists to read poetry, I think, because novelists get really caught up in things like, how do I get so and so outside? Like they're inside, I need to write a paragraph, and they have to be outside by the end of the paragraph, like which is not a very poetic way to feel as you're writing, and it can become clunky, like, okay, we'll go outside. Like, open the door, like he walks onto the grass, and he looks up at, you know, so then I read poems, and you see what a poet can do with a line, and you're like, oh no, okay. You go back to that paragraph, and you just see it differently. So I read some short story writers, but I do tend to read a lot of poetry, especially closer to the editing stages, because they don't let you get away with anything.
I always say that. It's funny, I haven't heard anyone else say this, but I believe that prose writers should read poetry, and the poets should read fiction. Yeah, because, you know, it's not a bad thing to have a story in a poem. This is like related, goes hand in hand with my last question, but I'm curious if there are any voices. Again, this is a very voicey book. Like so much happens, like you'll be churning pages because you want to know what happens and what becomes of Sally, but really the magic in the book, I think, is the voice of Sally. And I'm curious who some of your favorite voices in fiction are. Like, what characters did you fall in love with, the way that people will fall in love with Sally?
You know, one of the first characters I fell in love with was one of Molly's authors, Jane, in A Girl's Guide to Hunting and Fishing, Melissa Banks. Yeah, just loved that character. I love most of Alyssa Chappelle's narrators. I find her writing to be extremely voicey, I guess. Just the voice pops right off the page and catches you in the first line in so many of her stories. Now I'm drawing a blank.
No, those are both great.
But yeah.
Good. Girls Guide to Hunting and Fishing, I think, is a great comp. You can't actually use it as a comp because it was like so long ago, but I do think you guys are speaking in conversation with each other, interested in the same things.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that was a book where I just felt, I mean, it may be the same reaction that you were describing earlier, like it just felt like, oh, you're such a real person, and I feel so many things for you.
I have one more like in-depth question, then we're gonna do a lightning round where I'm just gonna, the first thing that comes to your mind you can say, but one thing I wanted to ask you is that I know you really felt, you know, it was not work, but it was emotionally taxing to dive back into this subject matter and this heavy material, but you really felt like you kind of needed to go there because until you did, all your writing was going to be about this, right? Like there was never going to be a book that wasn't in some way about this experience and your childhood because of it. And now you've written that book, right? So it is out of your system. So I'm curious if all of your writing up to this point has been in some way about that. What is your writing about now? What is that process like? It must be just a completely new page in a notebook. And is it rewarding? Is it just kind of, are you frustrated that there's not more? Because, you know, so much of the magic is in the chaos and tension and heartbreak, or what's that like?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, it did certainly, I got a sort of reputation in graduate school for writing about death, right? There was, a friend would say, like, no one can survive an Espach story. Like, you know, just, like, you start it and they're alive, by the end they're dead. You know, and I the Audible series that I am sort of completing now, which also started in graduate school, the title is In-Depth Market Research Interviews with Dead People, and I remember being in workshop and someone was like, but why do they have to be dead? Like, And it was like the thought never occurred to me. I was like, oh, they could be alive. But it's just not, that's funny though, I don't know. But, so it followed me, and it became, as I was writing, I was like, oh, here I go again. Like, I just can't, it's just where I kept going. And when I turned the manuscript into you, or really sold it, but then turned it into you, I would say that was the first time I felt totally free of it. Like, I could sit down and go back to some other projects, and it just didn't feel like a ball, like always returning to the lowest center. So I would say it's mostly been, 100% wonderful and fun, and I feel like I can fully explore some ideas that were percolating, but I just kept putting them on hold because I just had this feeling like I have to write this book now. I need to do it now and let it go and then move on. So far so good.
I can't wait to read whatever you're working on now. And okay, I lied. We're not going to go to the lightning round yet. One more question. I am always curious, being interviewed, what question you wish you were asked. Like, if you, what question are you disappointed that I did not ask you that you would like to answer and share with the class?
Oh my.
I'm kind of putting you on the spot. You don't have to. You can come back to that after the lightning round if you want.
What is my dream vacation? Oh, I don't know. I feel so like endlessly grateful to be asked literally anything, and I can't even imagine like.
Is there a question, you've been interviewed a few times already, is there a question you're surprised no one has asked, that you're just kind of like, oh, this book begs this question, how are you not asking me this?
Well, Molly has a question.
Yeah, I do. Only because I have to get a train.
Yeah.
So one of the things that's really, really unusual about this book is that Sally is in the second person. You did this. It gives the book a really, really unusual urgency. And almost no fiction is written from the second person. None. I mean, I can remember Jane McInerney from, I don't know, the 80s. But that was the thing that struck me immediately, was that sense of Sally's immediacy and a combined urgency with a longing for what she's describing. And now I'm leaving. Bye.
So is that a question? No. Thank you.
Well, yeah, how did you decide to write it in the second person? It's hard to sustain the second person, right? It's normally used for shorter things.
Right. Yeah, because you get
short.
irritated by it, for sure. It's a warning to all as readers. Yeah, I mean, but the book started with the title, Notes on Your Sudden Disappearance, so it was baked in from the start, and the whole thing was conceived of as like, okay, well, if you were somehow able to communicate to your sister after her death, like every little thing that happened in the wake of it, what would you say? Or really more specifically, what would she be interested in, right? Like, what did my boyfriend say about me, right? Or, I mean, that's for that particular character, that's what she would say. But, so that, once I started writing it in the second person, that actually was enough of a filter to help me figure out what parts of the story I'm going to tell and what parts of the story just do not matter. Because Kathy's the audience, and she only wants to know certain things about her death and about Sally's life after it, and all the other stuff can just kind of disappear. Choosing the second person was what unlocked it for me, but I also, as Molly said, no one really does it, and it's not like the marketable choice. So as I was doing it, I was like, why are you doing this? No. Like,
It's just harder. You set a harder bar
It's
for
just
yourself,
hard, yeah.
right? Because it's the intensity. Anything that's intense is hard to sustain.
It's hard to sustain.
But you do. So it's a smart choice. Okay, so lightning round just for fun, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So, okay, if any living person in the world could read this book, from like Jay-Z to your mom to Reese to Oprah to Barack Obama, what living person would you most want to have read this?
I don't know if this is Obama's genre, but I probably would have said my parents, but they read it. So I don't know if it's a specific person, more of a type, like a teenager who's sitting in their bed feeling like their life is shattered by something, and needs to, this teenager needs to not feel alone for a second, or maybe needs to laugh, or just be distracted. I mean, that's kind of, I wouldn't say who I was writing it for, but the audience.
You want
That's the
build.
kind of connection
Yeah.
that between writer and reader that I would say matters the most to me for this book.
Yeah. Okay, now how about any non-living person, from Abraham Lincoln to Betty White to, Plato, anybody?
Plato, that's interesting. The sad answer would be my brother Mike. The non-sad answer would be Jane Austen. I would really love her to critique it. Like, I just want to sit in a room and have her give me like the editorial critique of like, was it a good romance? Or like, I don't know. I just would love to hear what she would have to say. And I would actually, for some weird reason, love for her to just like tear it apart.
Okay, what living writer would you most want to have a drink with?
Living writer.
We'll get to non-living next.
Okay. Okay. I don't know. I think I've been watching Susan Orlean's Drunken Tweets. There's this great nonfiction writer who does a lot of literary profiles for the New Yorker, and she's someone I teach a lot. And sometimes during the pandemic, she would tweet while drinking, and it was very funny. And
Did she acknowledge that she'd been drinking, or was it just like, oh, Susan must be drunk?
I mean, there were many of them, so I missed some. She might have acknowledged it, but the world acknowledged it.
The world
yeah.
acknowledged it. Okay, I missed this. I need to go back.
And she was just so fun. She just seemed like she'd be a great writer to just joke around with. I don't know, but she's also a literary hero of mine. So,
Okay,
yeah.
I love it. Okay, non-living.
Non-living. When I learned about Aphra Behn, who I did not know about until a few years ago, but she was a 17th century woman playwright, and like the first woman writer who kind of really made an actual living off her writing. And she was also a spy for King Charles II. So all of that combined, I just feel like she would have a lot of stories.
Yeah,
Yeah.
love that. Okay, you might need more than one drink with her, Susan.
Yeah.
Okay, so what literary trend are you most over? What are you just like, if I read one more book about like a missing girl or blah, 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 I'm gonna die. What do you want us to move on from as a literary community?
As a community. I don't know. I did find the title trend of like the Time Traveler's Wife, which is a great title, but sort of spurred a
Wife of, daughter of.
like
situation.
insert occupation plus wife, sister, daughter, or like I feel like we've used that so many times
Yeah.
that we're now at like the dentist's cousin, or or I just feel, I don't know, it got to be a little much, but I will also say that I am a sucker for it every time.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's why it was huge.
I can see the temptation. I actually just went through a process with the writer. We had to find a new title for her book, and we really didn't want to use the like daughter of, wife of, because we're like it's about her.
Right.
It's not about who her father was or who her husband was, but it's got a poetry to it. So it was
does.
hard to avoid. So
Yeah.
I get why they do it, but I also get why you're over it. What is the best new novel that like just came out that you've read recently that you're just like glad it got its due, and you're like, yes, this deserved all the praise it got?
The last new novel, Claire Lombardo's The Most
Okay.
Fun We Ever Had. I actually listened to that on Audible, and which was a great way to do it. Just wonderful. exploration of these 4 different sisters, and I'm usually a pretty bad reader when it comes to like an ensemble cast. Like when the cast of characters is too big, and you switch from Jane to Robert to Pete. Like by the time we get to Pete, I'm like, no more. I don't. But Lombardo's book was, I don't know. Every character was super interesting and their own person, and I just loved it.
I love that.
Yeah.
She loves Alison's book too. It's a mutual fandom.
Mutual.
Yeah. Okay, so what is the best old novel, and by old I mean more than 5 years old, that you just stumbled upon and you're like, oh my god, I can't believe this took me so long. I love it so much more than I thought I would.
I just read, or within the past 2 years or so, The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, which is a book I should have read decades ago, but just didn't get around to it, and yeah, it blew me away.
Yeah. Okay, 2 last ones, and then we're going to turn over to the audience. The last book that surprised you by how much you loved or hated it. Any book that you were like, this is so my jam, and then it was terrible, or the opposite.
So I will say I've gotten really into the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan, which started just with an innocent watching of the Amazon show, The Wheel of Time. And then I started talking to friends about like whether the show is a faithful adaptation or not. I have a bad habit of like late at night opening my Kindle and reading a first chapter of something, and then just never returning to it. So I read the first chapter of Wheel of Time, and then like 4 months later, I'm on book 4, The Shadow Rising. So, and it's not, I'm like, yeah, no, it's like not usually what I read, and I was totally surprised. But I was like, oh, I get how this plot thing works. Like, he's a great storyteller.
Okay, and last question, then I'll turn it over to the audience for their questions, and that is, what book that no one else is reading, like what kind of like little book that has been overlooked, do you think that everyone should be reading, and just like don't understand like how it is not, this acclaimed, recognized masterpiece? I
think this book is a recognized masterpiece by a few critics.
Yeah.
But maybe not like people in general. Susan Steinberg's Machine.
I don't know it. Okay, so
yeah, just amazing.
Okay, I'm gonna buy a copy.
Yeah, it's a very lyrical novel, so don't like speed read it for plot. But it's beautiful, and it was one of the books I kept returning to actually when I was writing notes, just to kind of remember why I loved writing.
Yeah. Okay, so exciting. I'm gonna add it to my list. And now you guys, we can turn it over, right? Is that okay? Okay, take it away, guys. This is your chance to put Alison on the spot.
I did say ask me anything, but now I may regret that.
Alison, did you ever get writer's block during the process? I mean, how long was the process from the inception? I know you discussed it a little bit, but how long was the process from the idea to the actual script?
I don't know. I mean, the idea is so laced with the memoir that I was writing in grad school, so I would really say from then. But I would say probably the past 4 years I've been working on this draft. Okay. Yeah, I don't know if I get maybe this is what writer's block is, I don't know, but I get like the semester's over, you have 4 months to finish a novel panic.
Yeah, that's why I asked.
Which is like, I don't know, anytime you're approaching the page in panic, it's just never gonna work out. So I would be like, oh, well, I deserve a beach day, or I should go relax on a hammock until the ideas go. So, I would say usually all of June is spent just trying to like reorganize my brain until I'm no longer panicked and about what I can get done and the amount of time I have. And so yeah, but it certainly feels like writer's block when you open up that Word document and you just end up writing hello to yourself or something. It's like I don't, yeah, so.
Carrie.
My question is,
Yeah, I didn't feel that. For me, a novel is such a long process, and like it is so sometimes overwhelming that whenever like I sent a draft to Caroline or to Molly and Lucy, I would be very glad to not think about it. It's just like good riddance, sort of, like you've had someone stay over for like a little too long. Yes, my house is my own. And I would say I started to miss Sally and some of the characters later, and just in the way that like I was so used to thinking like, okay, well, what would Sally think, or. And then I would have those same thoughts, but there'd be nowhere for them to go. Like the book's over. Right. So it's time to put her away. So yeah, I would say it's not I think some writers talk about it like it's more an intense feeling. For me, it's not a very strong feeling. It's just a kind of recognition of, oh, yeah, it was fun to live in that world. And, but then, I'm sort of an obsessive writer, so I'm like, we'll just create a new one.
Allie,
Yes.
who would you have play Sally Kathy in the movie?
Oh, who would you have play Sally?
I asked you.
I think all of my references I think everyone I'm going to say is going to be like 37 now. Because if I haven't paid attention to it. I feel like Christina Ricci of
She's back
of
now,
the
yeah.
90s might play Sally. Kathy, I don't know. Maybe Cameron Diaz type or something. I don't know.
Like that? Feel the vibe.
Feel the vibe.
Guys, going, gone. Last chance. Put her on the spot. Some of you went to high school with her. Didn't she ever do anything mean that you're like, payback right now? And ask like a really mean question.
Oh, we got something in the back.
Did your father influence any of your writing at all?
Is that
Any
Fritz?
characters in there? Your father at all?
Allison, you don't need
It would be a very dull book, I'm sure.
No, he's been trying to get into my fiction for years.
Keep them out.
No, I mean, it is funny, this is my second book, so I've had, the first book everyone was like, it's you, and that's your dad, and that's your mom. And I was like, not really though. And then now it's another book and everyone's like, it's you, and that's your mom, and that's your dad. I'm like, well, they can't both be. Like, they're two actually very different lives. So it's, so no. I mean, there are some key phrases, but that's private. Yes.
So, this is kind of a random question, but as long as I've known you for, over 20 years, I feel like it makes sense that you are a writer. Like, it just always makes sense. But was there ever a time where you, were like, no, I'm gonna go to school and become an astronaut or something?
Yeah. It's funny, it was never a question, I was always like, I want to be a writer, even from a very young age. But it actually took a very long time for me to think, I could become one. Even when I went to college, I was like, am I gonna go to law school? Am I gonna become a high school teacher? I had a few other interests. And it just never crossed my mind that one could pursue becoming a writer, and I didn't even really know how. So I would say for most of my life I felt like a writer, but truly never thought of it as the thing that I would do. And I think of it now, I teach, and I don't think I could ever be only a writer. I think writing is so solitary, and that can be wonderful, but I tend to crave, after a while, social interaction. And so, there are a few moments where you're writing a lot, you're working on a deadline or trying to complete a long project, and those were the times where I was like, maybe I should become an adventure guide, or who will pay me to stand on top of a mountain? But I always knew that even if I did that, I would still be kind of writing on the side.